we are on our last chapter, Samuel 1, and then we're going to start Samuel 2. Now, I referred to this briefly last week, but I just want to, it pays here as we move from 1 Samuel to 2 Samuel to figure out, is there really any sense to the division between the two books? So just to put it briefly, there was never traditionally, there was no division between the two books. There was the book of Samuel and the book of Kings. The first time we see a division was in the Septuagint, the first translation of the Bible into Greek, which took place like the 2nd century BCE, so that we're talking about during a time when the temple still stood. It was a time when the Syrian Greeks, like the Hanukkah story time, around then. So Greek became at that point Hellenistic influences. Greek became a very, very important language throughout the Middle East and in Egypt and parts of Europe, so that, it made sense to translate the Bible into Greek. But this is what actually made the Bible more accessible later on when Christians started to read the Bible. The original Christians who were Jewish would read it in Hebrew, but many others ended up reading it in Greek. And so there you had a division already into the two books. And in fact, as I understand it, there actually is a division to 4 books because they put Samuel and Kings together as some kind of a Kings, 1, 2, 3, and 4. But anyway, what happened then is that when the Christian Bible, it took a while for the development of how it was structured, but sometime in the Middle Ages, the Christian Bible created chapters. The original Hebrew Bible did not have chapters. It had divisions into verses and to the various books, but it didn't have chapters. And it was actually a Christian, a monk, I believe, I forgot his name, who was the first one who divided the Bible into chapters. And so he was going based upon the original Septuagint, which had 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, and therefore 1 Samuel ends with chapter 31 and Samuel 2 begins with chapter 1. And so that was, where we got the chapter business. And so then later on, when the Jewish tradition took in the chapters, again, our Bible remains in Hebrew, and we have slight differences in order and stuff like that between the Jewish and Christian Bible. But the chapter division and the numbering of the verses by each chapter is something that we took from Christians. And so when we took the chapter and verse organization from Christians, that automatically gave us that 1st and 2nd Samuel. So today, everybody, does 1st and 2nd Samuel, but why is this relevant? Because as you will see, it is a really artificial division, okay? Because we're going to go from chapter 31 into 2 Samuel chapter 2 and chapter 1, and you're going to see it doesn't feel like it's a different book, and it doesn't feel like it's a different book because it isn't. Okay, so with that introduction, let's start chapter 31. Okay, so you'll recall what we did last week. We talked about, we finished chapter 30, but we also talked about how there was a parallel. Basically, 2 stories were going on at the same time. The story of David, he went up partway with the Philistines to join the battle. He's just sent back. When he comes back to Ziklag, he discovers the Amalekites have taken their women and children prisoner, have taken a lot of their possessions, and they went off, and David goes and gets his people together, and they go and attack the Amalekites, defeat them, kill them, take back the property, and come back. While that story is happening, the same night, that we have there, David going after going to the area of the Amalekite camp, that same night is when Saul is very afraid of the Philistines. He's not sure what to do, and he ends up seeking the woman at Endor and is told that he will die the next day in battle. So what we are now going to see is, so at the end of chapter 30, we learned about the conclusion of the battle. David takes the spoils from that battle from the Amalekites and then disperses them amongst the different elders of Judah. In chapter 31, we are going to learn about the battle. where Saul will actually lose his life, the Battle of the Philistines, which takes place exactly the same day that the previous story took place of David battling the Amalekites. So, chapter 31. The Philistines attacked Israel, and the men of Israel fled before the Philistines, and many fell on Mount Gilboa. So remember, this battle is taking place up in the Galilee. The Philistines pursued Saul and his sons, and the Philistines struck down Jonathan, Avinadav, and Malchishua, sons of Saul. We know these names from before. When we first met Saul, we have the list of his sons. But of course, it's only Jonathan that's the one we know. Jonathan, of course, was the son of Saul that was so close to David. The battle raged around Saul, and some of the archers hit him, and he was severely wounded by the archers. Saul said to his arms bearer, "Draw your sword and run me through, so that the uncircumcised may not run me through and make sport of me." Who are the uncircumcised? The Philistines. And in fact, it is that's used often when David first encounters Goliath. We refer to them as the uncircumcised. And in fact, you may recall that when one of the tests that Saul gives to David to test, how much of a warrior he is, he says he wants you to kill all these Philistines and bring their foreskins. Okay, so this idea of them being uncircumcised is a very defining marker of the Philistines. And many, we know that the idea of circumcision was something commanded by God to Abraham. Abraham circumcised Ishmael, first, and that was even before Isaac was born. And so Ishmael, to this day, Muslims have the tradition of circumcision, which we believe they inherited from their father Ishmael. And there is a sense also that many in the Middle East, whether from Ishmael or for whatever other reason, had a tradition of circumcision. So the Philistines, on the other hand, came from the west. Okay, I think we did discuss this when we first met the Philistines in the book of Judges, or earlier in the book. In any case, Philistines come from the west. The word Philistine in Hebrew is plishtin and means invader. Okay, so it's also not just to say they're uncircumcised, they're different from us. We're opposite kinds of peoples, but it's also to focus on the fact that they're not of the area even. They came from the west. No, nobody's circumcising, west of Israel. So I think that's an interesting use of the word here. Anyway, so here he's already been hit. And he recognizes the fact that he's not going to be able to continue fighting. He will fall into the hands of the Philistines. And the last thing he wants is for them to, make fun of him, to make sport of him, to deride him. And it's not just a personal issue, of course. He's the king of Israel. So there's a sense that if they whatever, mistreat him or persecute him or take him up, or whatever they might do, any kind of barbarism or whatever, it would not just be insult to his honor, but to the honor of Israel as well. And so he wants to avoid that at all costs, and he wants them, therefore, to help him finish the job. He's already wounded. Just take your sword and kill me. Finish the job off. So he says that to his arms bearer, to his, whatever, his assistant, his lieutenant, whatever. But his arms bearer in his great awe refused. What does this mean, in his great awe? I mean, he's the king. He doesn't want to be in a position, even though it clearly would be a merciful thing. It also makes sense for Israel. I mean, there's no question Saul is not going to survive this day. Not just that he knows it from the prophecy. His situation right now, having already been wounded in the battle, and the Philistines closing in around him, there's no way he's going to survive. But so in a way, by killing him, he would be taking mercy upon him, making it, let's say, quicker or whatever. But he says, no, he can't do that. This is the king in his great awe. He can't be a person who's going to kill a king, even if the king actually asked him to do it. So what happened? Saul then grasped the sword and fell upon it. Okay. And he basically killed himself, Saul. And that's really, and when his arms bearer saw that Saul was dead, he too fell on his sword and died with him. Okay, and again, there's a certain honor in this whole thing, but on the other hand, it raises a lot of questions because it is really not allowed to commit suicide in Jewish tradition, and it's a very fundamental issue because man is created in the image of God. And God is kind of the boss of this whole thing. So you definitely don't kill yourself because you leave it to God to decide when your time has come. So the question here is how was this okay? Was it not okay? There doesn't seem to be any criticism of any kind here in the Bible. And the Bible does not hesitate to criticize Saul whenever he has sinned. But we have no even a hint here that Saul did something wrong here. So, there's many who discuss this. And so one attitude is, well, this is an unusual circumstance, as we said, saving the honor of Israel and perhaps even the honor of God, not allowing the Philistines to catch him alive and make sport of him, maybe a reason to justify suicide, even though in normal situations it would not be allowed. Now, we have in Jewish tradition other circumstances where there was suicide. Of course, the most famous that you probably have heard of is Masada, where, although I heard recently that there's a theory now that they did not commit suicide, but actually that the Romans actually came up there and killed them. But there is this idea of suicide, which is, I think Josephus is the one who first writes about it. And they were up there in that fortress, defending themselves from the Romans. And when they realized they had no more hope and they were not going to survive, they commit suicide rather than falling into the hands of Romans and becoming slaves to the Romans, which is a very similar kind of situation to what we have here in Saul. They're like the last bastion defending the land of Israel and the autonomy of Israel from the Romans, who had just destroyed the temple. And so there is this idea of whether it be national honor or the glory of God that may be very similar to what we see here. Now, there's another situation that you may not be familiar with. During the First Crusade in the 11th century, there was, end of the 11th century, there was the Crusades. I have to say, many of my Christian friends never knew that the Crusades were massive murders against Jews through Europe. So if any of you are not yet aware of that, that is the case. This idea of going to liberate the Holy Land from the infidels, which at the time was in the hands of the Muslims. They'd killed a lot of Muslims when they got to Israel too, but along the way, they went through Jewish communities and literally murdered, raped, pillaged, Jewish communities, burnt Jews alive in synagogues, some of the horrors that we learned later on in the pogroms. And then, of course, in the Holocaust. This was where we first hear about these things in the Crusades, and particularly in this First Crusade. So there was a community in the Rhine, somewhere in what is today Germany, that committed suicide. They were being surrounded. They knew they were about to be killed, and they committed suicide rather than be forced to either convert or to be killed in a horrific way by these crusaders. So again, this kind of situation has come up over time. Is Saul's death a model for that? And that is just a question that I will leave, up in the air. But in 1944, there's a very famous Israeli poet whose name was Alterman, and he wrote a poem where he's basically wrote a poem based on the story of Saul. Okay, and I don't have it in English, but I'll just tell you this is very interesting. It's a poem about Saul's death and falling on his sword. It was written in 1944 when news of what was going on in Europe had started to come out. Of course, it wasn't until after the war in 1945 that people really knew the extent of the Holocaust. But already in 1944, they knew that Jews were being killed in terrible situations. in Europe by the Germans. And so he writes this at the very end when he talks about the king, and he says, well, at the very end, the king, met his fate. But he says, but he had an heir who will arise, not arise, who will step up. Okay, he had an heir who would step up because he fell on that sword in his own land. If he had been, one second. Yeah. So, and so there's a reference there that he's kind of in a hint kind of way comparing the death of Saul, who falls on his sword as a result of this persecution, but being in the land of Israel. And therefore, even though he personally came to a tragic end, he had an heir. He had a continuation. Of course, he's referring to King David. Because this happened in the land of Israel, this did not mean the end of the people of Israel. It just meant that Saul came to a tragic end. There was going to be a continuation. He had an heir, and that was the next king. Okay? And he's basically comparing this to these kind of situations like the Crusades in 1099, like the Holocaust, which he was just beginning to hear about. When in those cases, when people committed suicide in order to avoid this kind of death, or just being killed by their enemies, how much more tragic, how much more empty it all is, because this was happening outside the land of Israel in a place where they had no place of their own. Now, 1944 is before the state of Israel exists, but he's writing from this faith that the state of Israel will establish. We are in our own land, and therefore this kind of a fall, it has to have a continuation. There will be a continuation. So I just wanted to bring that. I thought that was very interesting. Okay, so let's continue. Let's continue with the story. Verse 6. Thus Saul and his 3 sons and his arms bearer, as well as all of his men, died together on that day. Now, of course, the other people were killed by the Philistines. The only 2 that actually committed suicide was Saul and his arms bearer. And when the men of Israel on the other side of the valley and on the other side of the Jordan saw that the men of Israel had fled, and that Saul and his sons were dead, they abandoned the towns and fled. The Philistines then came and occupied them. So in other words, the whole camp of Israel is dispersed, and the Philistines have a complete and total victory in this whole area there in the north, in the Galilee, near the Gilboa. The next day, the Philistines came to strip the slain, and they found Saul and his 3 sons lying on Mount Gilboa. They cut off his head and stripped him of his armor, and they sent them throughout the land of the Philistines to spread the news in the temples of their idols and among the people. Okay, so here it's not clear if they sent bits of the armor or they just sent word. I think they just sent word. It sent word all over saying, to make sure people knew, guess what, guys? We have slain the king of Israel. Victory is in our hands. They placed his armor in the temple of Ashtaroth, and they impaled his body on the wall of Beit Shan. Now, Beit Shan is a city in Israel today. It's located just south of the Sea of Galilee, very hot place. And today there is it's a town, it's a modern town, but it's also right next to the ruins of what was the ancient Beit Shan, and they've excavated those ruins and they excavated the ancient walls. It is a Canaanite city, and then became, at this time already, it is definitely not a Jewish city at this time. Okay, so the Philistines, I'm sure they have people living there, but don't forget, during this time, there's still a lot of Canaanites, not a lot, but there are these pockets of Canaanites or pagan worshipers, who are still in the land of Israel. And Beit Shan is one of those places. So Beit Shan would have been a place where the Philistines would have settled. They would have found, common ground with these, Canaanites. They were all pagan worshipers, and they would have connected with one another. So that's why it's so easy for them. They go to this Beit Shan and they put his head on, or his body, they put his body on Beit Shan. And here comes a very interesting story. When the inhabitants of Yavesh Gilad heard about it, what the Philistines had done to Saul, all their stalwart men set out and marched all night. Now, Yavesh Gilad is like in the Golan Heights of today. It's on the eastern side of the Jordan River, northeast of Beit Shan, okay? And this is part of Manasseh. If you remember from the original division of the land of Israel, Manasseh, the tribe of Manasseh, is split in two places, in both sides of the Jordan. One side of the Jordan is actually where I'm sitting right now, because my home of Karnei Shomron is in the southernmost part of Manasseh, and the other part of Manasseh is across the river. There's actually different theories as to where exactly Manasseh was. Is it parallel to the part on the west over to the east, going up as far as the Golan Heights, but not into the Golan Heights? And there's others who say, no, it goes actually further up north. But in any case, this is what we're talking about, the eastern side of the Jordan River, northeast of Beit Shan. And when they heard about it, okay, they came down, they removed the bodies of Saul and his sons from the wall of Beit Shan and came to Yavesh and burned them there. Then they took the bones and buried them under the tamarisk tree in Yavesh, and they fasted for 7 days. So first of all, I would comment here, when they burned the body, this is not considered to be a desecration. They actually, if it was impaled on the walls of Beit Shan, you could assume that there's already a degree of decomposition that has already taken place. And ultimately, if you remember from the Bible, there's many times when it talks about, and he was gathered into his home. And so it was typically the bones that were buried. Sometimes they buried the body, and then after a year would uncover the body, which had already decomposed, and then taken the bones. So here, what they're doing is they're taking already a very decomposed body. They have nothing to do with it, so they're burning the body to get to the bones, okay? They're not trying to burn them and cremate them or something like that. And this is, of course, not something that we do today. But what I'm trying to explain is that they're doing this not as a way of desecrating Saul's body, but a way of honoring him in order to bury him, okay, in a rightful place. They bury him in their own area, and then they took they fasted for 7 days. So you see these people in Yavesh Gilad from the tribe of Manasseh, okay, who are particularly connected to Saul, and they're doing this wonderful thing. And the question is, how are they connected? Now, I don't know how many of you will remember this, but actually Saul is very connected to these people, and it starts with a story in the book of Judges. If you look at the book of Judges, chapter 21, we are in the story, that horrible, horrible story of the concubine of Gibeah. And that becomes just to remind you of the story, there's this man and he has this concubine, and they come to Gibeah, and instead of being hosted kindly, the people of the town, and this is in Benjamin territory, they come and they take the girl and they rape her and they kill her, and then her husband, or whatever you call it, cuts up her body and sends it all over and basically that becomes a call of war against Benjamin. Okay, and that's exactly what happened. It's a huge civil war where all the tribes of Israel gather up against Benjamin, and in the end almost decimate the entire tribe of Benjamin. So the stories having to do with Yavesh Gilad is as follows. In chapter 21, verse 8, it says as follows. First of all, they're after the war here, and they're trying to figure out what to do, because they realize there's almost no men left of Benjamin, the whole tribe of Benjamin. There's no women. And what are we going to do? Does that mean we will have erased a tribe of Israel? They realize maybe they went a little too far. Okay. So they're asking, is there anyone from the tribes of Israel who do not go up to the Lord at Mitzpah? What happened at Mitzpah? Just before they embarked on this war, they took a pledge that nobody would give their daughters to anyone from Benjamin. Okay, so now they're trying to figure out, how are we going to give women to these men of Benjamin so that they can continue the tribe? So they're trying to figure out, is there anybody who didn't go up? Now, no one from Yavesh Gilad had come to the camp, to the assembly. for when the roll of the troops was taken, not one of the inhabitants of Yavesh Gilead was present. So here you have a war against Benjamin, and the people in this faraway area of Manasseh didn't join the war. Okay, so the assemblage dispatched 12,000 of the warriors, instructing them as follows: go and put the inhabitants of Yavesh Gilead to the sword, women and children included. This is what you are to do: prescribe every man and every woman who is known to man carnally. Okay. They found, so every man and every woman who was not a virgin were put to death. Why? Because they didn't come and participate in the war. So then they found among the inhabitants of Yavesh Gilead 400 virgins who had not known a man. Okay. And they brought them to the camp at Shiloh, which is in the land of Canaan. So this was their solution. Okay. Because they had never taken that pledge, which is what brought upon them this terrible massacre of most of the people of Yavesh Gilead, but it did leave 400 women who were not massacred. So they went and got those women, and they brought them to marry these 600 Benjamites who were left. They married 400 of the Benjamites, and then the last 200 of the Benjamites ended up getting their wives at this festival in Shiloh. Okay, but what did that mean? That meant that these people from a town in Manasseh, who were all from Manasseh, these 400 women from Manasseh, okay, were married to men in Benjamin. The 2/3 of the remaining men of Benjamin, which means there's tremendous family connection now between the people of Yavesh Gilead and Benjamin. Saul is a Benjamite, okay? He's from that same family. And we see this plays out also in Saul's life. So if you look at in 1 Samuel chapter 11, okay, here we have a situation where the people, again, we find Yavesh Gilead. The people of Yavesh, all the way up there, are being threatened by Nahash, the king of Ammon. And this is one of the first things that Saul does when he becomes king. He goes and defends them. Okay, and this was all also something of like, why did Saul feel so moved? And so that is because, number one, he's related to them, but number two, this is part of this defense pact, perhaps, that the people of Benjamin and the people of Yavesh Gilead have a special, both their relatives, and they have this situation of a tradition of looking out for one another. So here is a situation where these people from Yavesh Gilead feel probably beholden to Saul. The fact that he saved them. He saved them back there when they were being attacked by the Ammonites. And so this is like the least they can do to honor this man who was not only the king of Israel, but who had done so much for their own people. So that kind of brings the story, full swing. All right, so here we go. At the end of this chapter, Israel's defeated and dispersed, and Saul is dead, and his sons are dead. And okay, now what? So now we're going back to David. Remember, David's back down south. Okay, what goes on next? After the death of Saul, David had already returned from defeating the Amalekites. Oh, we're at 6:30 already. Oh my gosh. I guess we're going to have to wait for this next chapter for next week. Okay. Oh, that's too bad. I was all ready for that chapter. Okay, we're going to go into that chapter next week. It's a wonderful, wonderful chapter. So, any questions, anybody?
No, it was interesting because I wrote a piece about Alterman for the class this morning. He's fascinating man. Yeah. I didn't read about that poem, but there's a lot of several others.
Well, this poem was called, I don't remember. I don't think I wrote down what it was called. But if you Google Alterman, poem about Saul's death or something, I'm sure you'll find it. It is in English. It was translated. I just didn't.
That's okay. I've been reading in Hebrew. That's okay.
Oh, you're reading in Hebrew? You're doing Alterman in Hebrew?
Yeah.
Wow, you're advanced. That's great. That is great. Yeah. So you look for that.
Yeah.
That you'll find it. Okay. Any other questions, anybody?
Thank you for putting everything together. Really helps. Well, sort of different bits and connecting them.
Lynn, what would you like? Yes.
Masada, you said about them committed suicide. I think I'd always heard that it was that some people had killed, like the butchers had actually killed people. It's not everybody went out and committed suicide. It was really only the ones that were left at the end who had killed the others that would have committed suicide.
Yes, they're the only ones who committed suicide, but it was really this mass suicide kind of thing where they drew lots.
Right.
And to decide who would go first and who was going to kill who.
Right.
And, so yeah, it was the only people who actually committed suicide were the people at the end. But it was still this idea of taking a life
Yes.
in order to avoid being captured by the enemy.
Right. Yes. Yes. And yes, the Crusaders were terrible people.
But it was the church. It was.
Yeah, we have such glowing reports
authorized by the church.
What? Well, we would feel different about the Crusaders. I mean, we wouldn't like to. I don't think any of us would like to own them. They were nothing to do with us.
No, nothing to do with you. But if you were a member of the church back in the 11th century, they would have a lot to do with you. So thank God,
yes.
The church kind of got over that. But what I find amazing is that the church doesn't teach this in most places. I've met so many people. I'll tell you the truth. When I know in the States, I don't know in the UK if it's the same way, but in the States, you have these religious revivals, okay, that are very often called a crusade. Okay, they will use that word in a positive way.
Unfortunate.
Okay, and I'm like, ugh. And when you talk to people, and for them, the crusade was this amazing, journey, or was an amazing activity to speak for God and to do for God, and it's all about that. And they just don't know. They had no idea that what they were doing is like, murdering Jews along the way, literally.
But in history, I mean, I haven't learned it that, but I know one of my students, when they were studying the Crusades, and you'd think it was something, rather wonderful and sort of a historical thing, not a clue about what was actually happening.
Right. So when we studied the Crusades as Jews, that's all we learned about. The Crusades was a bunch of murderers moving, Christian murderers and the half of the church, and this is Richard the Lionhearted. It's like some of these people that you see as heroes, but on the other hand, as a Jew, we always know, no, these were the arch murderers, and they were the precursors to the pogroms and the Holocaust.
Absolutely.
Inquisition. They were before the Inquisition.
Mm.
Yeah. Can I ask another question? I'm not familiar with the poem, but he said that Saul had an heir, and you mentioned David. Would that not have been Mephibosheth, whatever it was, the chap?
Right. I mean, I think what he's trying to say is Mephibosheth takes over. Mephibosheth is clear, not Mephibosheth, Ishbosheth. Ishbosheth takes over, clearly not appointed by God, clearly not a legitimate king, and it doesn't last very long.
David, sorry. I thought David found one of Saul's sons, the one that had been fallen out the window and did his legs in.
Yes. Oh, the one that fell and became crippled?
Yes.
Okay. So what we're talking about here is not an heir as in son, but an heir to the king. Okay. Right. So yes, Saul had two surviving sons. One is Ishbosheth, who does actually rule, and we're going to be getting into these stories in 2 Samuel, but he does actually rule, but he's not considered legitimate. And of course, at some point, he rules for 7 years. During that point, David rules for 7 years in Judah, and there's like a civil war going on. Okay, but clearly the legitimate heir and the one that God wants to be the king of Israel and who actually unites the kingdom, that's David. So in that sense, in other words, he has a continuation. I think the point is his death does not mark the destruction of Israel. His death marks the end of his kingdom. There'll be another one. And so that's how Altman kind of draws this distinction between the death of Jews abroad as opposed to the death of Jews in the land of Israel. It's a very Zionist, statement here that it's a whole different ballgame. kind of thing.
Thank you.
All right. Anyway, thank you for joining me today, and we will see you again next week.